All right, hello and welcome everyone to another Politics and Prose Live. I am Bashan. I am part of the event staff for Politics and Prose. Before we do get started, just want to go over a couple of quick items. First is that at any point during this event, you will be able to go to the chat section and you will be able to find a link for Our Bodies, Their Battlefields by Christina Lamb. And in addition to that, you'll also be able to find a link for The Apology by V, also formerly known as Eve Ensler. The other thing is that we would ask that anyone who would have any questions for the authors, would you please refer them to the separate Q&A box, just so it could help us to keep organized and facilitate the question and answer period. So without any further ado, I am going to be introducing you to V, who is formerly known as Eve Ensler, as I once said. V is the Tony Award-winning playwright of the theatrical phenomenon, The Vagina Monologues, along with many other plays. She has authored a number of books, including her latest bestsellers, The Apology and In the Body of the World. She is the founder of V-Day, the 22-year-old global activist movement, which has raised over $120 million to end violence against all women and girls, cisgender, transgender, and those with fluid gender identities, and founder of 1 Billion Rising, the largest global mass action to end gender-based violence in over 200 countries, as well as a co-founder of City of Joy. A survivor of violence, V has dedicated her life to ending violence against all women and girls and Mother Earth itself. And V, you may take it from here.
Thank you, Bajan. I'm so excited to be back at Politics at Prose. I love this bookstore. I only wish I was there in person. And I just want to welcome everybody who's here. Thank you for coming out on this Saturday to spend with Christina and I. I am so moved and excited to be here today with Christina Lamb. She is really one of my favorite foreign correspondents, and one is Britain's leading foreign correspondent and a best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, starting with Afghanistan after an unexpected wedding invitation led her to Karachi in 1987 when she was just 22. She moved to Peshawar, where I've been a few times myself, to cover the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union, and within 2 years, she had been named Young Journalist of the Year. Since then, she has won so many awards, but 15 major awards, including 5 times being named Foreign Correspondent of the Year and Europe's top war reporting prize, the Prix Bayeux. She was made an OBE by the Queen in 2013 and is an honorary fellow of University College at Oxford. She is currently the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, right? Yes. And she is particularly known for her writing highlighting how war affects women. She's written 9 books, including the best-selling The Africa House and I Am Malala. And we're here to talk about her latest amazingly powerful critical book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women. This is the first major account to address the scale of rape and sexual violence in modern conflict. In Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, she gives voice to women in conflict, exposing how in modern warfare, rape is used by armies, terrorists, militias as a weapon to humiliate, terrify, and carry out ethnic cleansing. Through rape, though rape was formalized as an international war crime in 1919, the International Criminal Court has convicted no one. This incredible book, brave book, deeply compassionate book, calls on us to listen and to act against this, the world's most neglected war crime. And, you know, Christina has spoken to survivors in the book across 4 continents. She talks to women in Southeast Asia, women I know very well, the comfort women who were enslaved by the Japanese during World War II and held as sex slaves, to the chilling sexual torture carried out by the Argentine junta that seized power in 1976, the horrific gang rapes of Rohingyas tied to banana trees by Burmese soldiers in 2017, from the 1970s Bangladeshi war, where thousands of women were raped by Pakistani troops, to the Yazidi women and children who witnessed the mass murder of their families before being enslaved by ISIS, and the Nigerian schoolgirls forced to be Boko Haram's bushwives and slaves. Along the way, Christina uncovers incredible heroism and bravery in women, including the Bosnian women, who I also know very well, who have hunted down more than 100 war criminals. The Aleppo beekeeper, rescuing Yazidis, and the Congolese doctor, my dear friend, Dr. Denis Mukwege, who's the co-founder with me and Christine Schuler, describer of the City of Joy, who has risked his life to treat more rape victims than anyone else on this earth. Rape is as old as war, but it is a preventable crime. And I think Christina's book demands that we recognize the horrific reality of what rape survivors go through, mostly women. Bearing witness does not guarantee it won't happen again, but it certainly can eliminate an excuse that the world simply didn't know. And by the way, the reviews for the book have been brilliant. Anthony Beaver at The Spectator said it's quite literally the most powerful and disturbing book I've ever read. Lindsay Hilsum at The Guardian said in the Me Too era, the impetus to believe women, Christina Lamb quite rightly does, while never losing her journalistic rigor in such an important and harrowing book. And Melanie Reed at The Times says, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield is a brave, harrowing book, and Were There Justice in the World would be at the top of the bestsellers list for weeks. One of the saddest, most shocking, and devastatingly authentic books I've ever read. I have to echo all of that. I've spent many years in war zones, Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, Congo, Afghanistan, and I feel like this is the book I've been waiting for my whole life. As I said in my own blurb, Christina has done something extraordinary. She's written women into the history of war. And by talking to women across the world in various war zones, she's woven a vision of how the systemic tactic of rape as a weapon of war has devastated the lives of thousands of women and needs to be treated with the seriousness and attention of any war crime. So I want to thank her for writing this book. I know how hard it is to hear the stories, to write about them, to taste such suffering and sorrow and pain, to bear witness, and then to experience the lack or care of response from the world. I admire her so much for continuing to sound this alarm and to do the hard, ongoing work of exposing the crimes and deepening our understanding. And I just want all of us to welcome Christina Lamb. I'm so happy we're here with her today. And maybe, Christine, you'd like to begin by reading something from the book.
Thanks, Bea, and I'm so excited to be here with fabulous Bea, who's been such an inspiration, and also Politics and Prose. I used to be Washington correspondent back in the days when you had a president called Barack Obama, and I loved going to Politics and Prose, and I'm only sorry that not to be there in person, and hope it's not too long before we can all start meeting at places like that again. But thanks for joining us. I know that lots of people might be distracted, as they are in my country, by watching a certain hospital at the moment. So I think this is an extremely important issue that really deserves international attention, which is why I wrote the book. And so I thank you for caring enough to watch tonight. And I'm just going to start by reading a little bit, just to give a sense of what these women went through. They put the names in the bottle and began to draw them out. 2 names, 10 girls. 10 names, sorry, 10 girls. The girls quivered like kittens caught under a dripping tap. For them, this was no lucky dip. The men pulling out the slips of paper were fighters from Islamic State, and each would take a girl as a slave. Naima stared at her hands, blood pounding in her ears. The girl next to her was younger than her, about 14, and mewling with fear. But when Naima tried to hold her hand, one of the men whipped off his belt and lashed them apart. That man was older and larger than the others, around 60, she guessed, with a belly cascading over his trousers and a vicious curl to his lips. By then she had been 9 months in ISIS captivity. She knew none of them were kind, but she prayed that one didn't pick out her name. Naima. The man who read out her name was Abu Danoun. He looked younger, almost like her brother, the hair on his chin still fluff, Maybe he would have less cruelty in his heart. The drawer continued. The fat man picked out the young girl next to her, but then he said something to the others in Arabic, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills and slapped them on the table. Abu Danun shrugged, pocketed the money, and handed over his slip of paper. Minutes later, the fat man was shoving her into his black Land Cruiser and driving through the streets of Mosul, a city she had once dreamed of visiting, but which was now the capital of these monsters who had swept into her homeland and abducted her and 6 of her brothers and sisters, among thousands of others. She stared through the tinted windows. An old man sitting on a cart was whipping a donkey to jerk it forward, and people were out shopping, though the only women in the streets were in black hijab. It was strange to see everyday life still going on for other people, almost like watching a movie. Her captor was an Iraqi called Abdul Hasib, and he was a mullah. The religious ones were the worst. He did everything to me, she later recounted. Hitting, sex, pulling my hair, sex, everything. I was refusing, so he forced me and hit me. He said, "You are my Sabiya, my slave." After that, I just lay there and tried to float my mind above my body as if it was happening to someone else, so he couldn't steal all of me. In the end, she was sold to 12 different men. She lists them one by one, their nom de guerre and real names, even their children's names, all of which she committed to memory, for she was determined they would pay. To be sold like that from one to another as if we were goats was the worst, she said. I tried to kill myself, to throw myself out of a car. Another time, I found some tablets and took the lot. But still, I woke up. It felt as if even death didn't want me.
Devastating, devastating. I think one of the things about this book is you're really telling us that we can't turn away because you have turned so deeply towards it. And I think maybe it would be good to begin with you telling us why did you feel compelled to write this book? What drove you?
So I've been a foreign correspondent for 33 years, which makes me feel old, and mostly covering conflicts. And as you know, we don't seem to be able to end wars anymore. So lots of these wars that I've covered, like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria and Yemen, go on and on. And all the time that I've been covering these, I've been most interested in how people keep their life together when a war is happening. I'm not interested in the fighting, really, the bang bang. I don't like it. I wish it would stop. What I'm interested in is how people keep their life together. Because even if you think about it, like Afghanistan, the war's been going on 40 years. Syria has been going on 9 years. So people still have to go to work, to educate their children, to get married, to look after the elderly, all of these things that are still happening at the same time as the fighting. And I'm really interested in that. And the people that are mostly keeping all that together are the women. So I've always focused on that side of the war. And that's, to me, very heroic. And I always say that women's names should be on war memorials just the same as men, because what they're doing in war is as important, maybe more important than the fighting. But there's another side of what happens to women in war, and that's the brutality and the use of sexual violence against women. And we've seen it through the centuries, and we see it in all different countries for lots of different reasons. But in the last few years, being a correspondent, I have seen more brutality and more sexual violence than any time in my life. And it doesn't make sense to me. We are in the 21st century. Why is this happening in so many places on such a scale? Honestly, I could have spent the rest of my life writing my book because it's happening so much. And the first time I really became aware of the horror of it was meeting Yazidi Girls, the light name that I just read about. And the first time I met any of them was in a refugee camp in a small Greek island called Leros. And they were in the ruins of an asylum, actually, a mental asylum. And so it was a really kind of eerie setting with all crumbling debris and all the roof all coming in and big holes everywhere. And these people, I'd never seen people where it was so clear something really terrible had happened to them, like all the light had gone out of their eyes. And the women, some of them had children, and they didn't even seem to be noticing as the children were almost falling into these big holes. So I started talking to them about where they come from, and they told me stories like nothing I had ever heard, which was about being abducted by these ISIS fighters and kept and taken to a place called Galaxy Cinema, which was like a latter-day slave market where they were separated into groups, whether they were considered ugly or beautiful. And then the fighters would come and touch their hair and touch their breasts and decide which one they wanted to take with them. And I just was really horrified by what they were telling me. So that was in 2014, 2015. But then around the same time, I was going to Nigeria a lot, because you might remember in April 2014, the Chibok girls in Nigeria were abducted from their school in the middle of the night. More than 250 girls taken by Boko Haram fighters into the Sambisa forest and forced to be their bushwives. And when I went to talk to people about that, I discovered that tens of thousands of girls had been taken. And this came to world attention really because of that hashtag, Bring Back Our Girls, which, remember, Michelle Obama and Kim Kardashian and other people were holding up and taking selfies. But this was actually happening on a massive scale. And then in 2017, I was in Bangladesh when the Rohingya Crisis happened, when the army in Burma or Myanmar started going into Rohingya villages and setting fire to huts and killing the men, and then taking the women and tying them to banana trees and gang raping them in front of their children. And so all of these things were happening within a few years on a huge scale. They were actually being reported a lot because the women were telling us what had happened. And nothing was happening. And so I just became more and more angry about it. And that's what made me start to really look into this issue in much more detail.
I'm in agreement with you, having spent time in some of those places and also done interviews with many of those women you were talking about. And I actually do believe that sexual war crimes are escalating. And I'm just wondering what are some of the reasons you believe that this escalation is occurring, in theory, in a moment when we have such awareness or such growing awareness about sexual violence?
I mean, I think it's partly that just silence about it, that people seem to think that it's an issue that doesn't matter. So if you read kind of military histories and things about wars, there's no mention of any of this, which are mostly written by men. I think it's also because at the end, when wars do end and there are peace negotiations, it's usually been male negotiators. And again, they don't regard this as a serious issue. But the number one reason is impunity. I mean, as you said in the introduction, no one's being brought to justice for this. And even in the cases where we do know, like the Yazidi and the Rohingya, and they bravely spoke out and told the world what was happening to them. And these are not, as you said, easy stories for anybody to tell. On the contrary, nothing happened. Not a single person has been prosecuted for what happened to the Yazidis. Not a single Boko Haram fighter has been prosecuted for what they've done in Nigeria. And not a single Burmese soldier or Buddhist militia has been brought to task. Indeed, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a de facto leader of Myanmar, is still, regarded by many people as a sort of icon or beacon of human rights. So That's the biggest problem. And as long as that doesn't change, people are going to carry on and doing this. And, you know, it is a very effective weapon, sadly. It's the cheapest weapon known to man. It's much cheaper than a Kalashnikov bullet. And it's very easy way to clear a village if you want to take control of it, or to subjugate a different religious or ethnic group.
Yes, I think the cheapness factor is a huge factor, because you don't have to spend a lot of money on ammunition or bullets or tanks. And I just want to echo what you're saying about impunity. You know, I have the comfort women who, as we know now, many are in their 80s and 90s, and most of them have died. They have waited for more than 70 years for justice. They have still, you know, held vigils for all these years and never received justice. I mean, they were really the first of sexual women who really suffered sexual violence, and there's been no justice there. So
and in their case, there's not even acknowledgement. I mean, they raised money to have a statue for comfort women in Manila, and it was taken down by the government.
I'm proud to say that there's now one in San Francisco, and it has not been taken down. But you're absolutely right. The Japanese government has never said, I'm sorry, officially, ever, for what's been done. There's an inscription at the beginning of the book that I found very heartbreaking and beautiful, where it says, "We have given our most precious thing and died inside many times, but you won't find our names engraved on any monument or war memorial." And that was from Aisha, a survivor of rape in the 1971 Bangladeshi war. It really kind of sums up your book in many ways. And I think it would be really wonderful just to unpack that inscription and talk a little bit about what all that means.
So actually, when I was covering the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, one day I got talking to a Bangladeshi man and an old man who had fought in the civil war in Bangladesh, the war for independence in 1971, because before that Bangladesh had been part of Pakistan. And he said to me, you know, this is nothing new to us, what is happening to the Rohingya. So I said to him, what do you mean? And he said, you know, our women were taken by the Pakistani army who came here and raped on a massive scale. In fact, I mean, estimates are that at least 200,000 women were raped. And that case was very much, as most of the cases I've described in the book, was very much where rape has been used as a specific weapon, and soldiers were given orders to do that. So I was very interested in what he said, because he said to me that he felt ashamed that he had been given honors and he'd been given a pension, and people gave him a lot of respect because he'd fought in the war. And he said, and yet these women that all these terrible things happened to, they have to live a life of shame, and people won't speak to them. So because of that, I went to try and find some of the women, and I met Aisha in a group that called themselves the Mothers Club, because it's difficult for them to meet publicly for what they did, because it's still regarded as shameful. And you know, I mean, this is one of the saddest things about this issue, that the people who are having wrong done to them and having these terrible things are often then the people who are castigated and ostracized from their communities, rather than the perpetrators who are doing it. And that I just found heartbreaking. And so these women I met in a village in Bangladesh, I mean, they just lived a miserable life for about 50 years since the war, and their families had disowned them. And it had been a real struggle for them to survive. And yet they'd done absolutely nothing wrong. Wrong had been done to them.
Yes, exactly.
I think this soldier, he said to me, we call them women who stare into space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think this notion that somehow that if you're in the battlefield and you're a soldier, you're fighting the war, and if you're a woman who has been raped or abused, you're somehow stigmatized, weirdly is stigmatized, not victim, but it's victim who's brought this on yourself rather than somebody who's been part of the same story. And I think that is one of the hardest things I certainly know and in the work we've done over the years, watching women overcome, it's been one of the hardest aspects. I think one of the things I want to ask you, and I know you're not going to have all the answers because I don't think any of us do, but this issue has been kept silent for so long. I remember traveling the world with Dr. Mukwege, who was speaking out against the atrocities happening on the bodies of Congolese women. And we went to so many countries and places. And I remember being at places like the European Union and the UN, places that should have been fully aware of what was happening to the women in Congo for 15 years. And there was just this profound ignorance and indifference, which felt utterly maddening. And I've experienced that in every war. Ignorance, but it's kind of willful ignorance, and this indifference, and this refusal to get upset about it, this refusal to really take on what is happening, the destruction to women's bodies, the destruction to their psychology, the destruction to the future of families, the destruction to the community. So what is the silence about, Christina?
It's just so difficult to understand, I think. I just think that a lot of people somehow think that it's a side issue. And also, when I talk to people at the beginning about writing a book on this, many people said to me, but, why would you write a book on that? It's war, there's been rape in war, ever since the time immemorial, which is true in a way. I mean, if you go back through the history books, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the very first written history by Herodotus opens with abduction of women by the Greeks and Phoenicians and Trojans. But, I'm sorry, we are in the 21st century. I mean, it's not acceptable that we're saying, oh, well, it's been happening for a long time, and so that's somehow okay. No, it's not okay. We've made it a war crime. We should be enforcing that. I can't help but think, as I said before, that, one of the problems is that wars, when they are negotiated, when peace is negotiated, that it's largely men that are doing it, and they don't see this as an important issue. A country that I have been very closely involved with all through my career and I'm passionate about is Afghanistan, and they are having peace negotiations at the moment. And women really, really had to fight to be part of the Afghan government civil society negotiating team. And in the end, there are only 3 out of 20 negotiators, which is not acceptable, but it's better than nothing. But this is a problem, because then to the men, this isn't really something.
I can hear you.
To the men. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Hello?
Hello?
Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
So to the men who are negotiating this is something that isn't important to them. And I, for example, went to the Chief Justice in the Iraqi courts that are trying ISIS fighters, and they're trying them on terrorism charges. So I said to him, have any of these ISIS fighters kept Yazidi women as sex slaves? And he said, yes, lots of them. So I said, well, are you trying any or prosecuting any of the men for that? And he looked at me and laughed and said, why would we do that? Mm-hmm. And I said, because they did something terrible to these women. It's a crime. And he said, but they killed people. The rape doesn't matter in comparison to that. And that, I think, is the problem. And that, to most of the women I spoke to said to me they would rather have died than gone through this.
Because I still think in the year 2020, the world does not yet understand what rape is and doesn't understand the impact of rape. And when it's being used as a systematic tactic of war in a massive scale, I don't think, unless you sit with women and listen to women and touch women and feel women, you don't really know what rape does to people. So can you talk a little bit about it? What does rape do to women?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult for many of these women to talk about what happened to them, that many of them for decades never spoke about it, and that's so hard. And it's not just something physical, it's destroyed their social standing in their areas. Often it's destroyed their confidence in themselves. It's left lasting psychological impact. And so, you know, on so many levels, it's so destructive. And that, sadly, is why it's successful as a weapon, because, you know, if you go into a place and rape the women, you're also humiliating the men that they can't look after their women, and you're basically leaving this lasting scar on them. But, you know, I understand that this is a difficult crime to prosecute anywhere. I mean, in the UK, we had our lowest level on record of successful convictions for rape last year. So it's not just a problem of rape in war, it's something general, but it's a much bigger problem in conflict. I mean, accountability is the exception, not the rule, in sexual violence in war.
Are there one or two stories of women that you met along the way that's really stand out and typify or reveal the central dynamics of women in war, or one that just lives in forever in your heart?
Yeah. Well, lots of them, but I mean, there was one of the Yazidi girls who I went to see, who is 16, and she had been kept by a fat ISIS judge and raped every day. And she said that the worst night of her life was when he brought back a 10-year-old girl and raped her in the room next door. And she had to listen to the girl crying for her mother all night. That story, you know, was so sad. And when she was telling me the story, and these stories, you know, take a long time, sometimes days to tell. And she kept stopping. And I said to her, "Are you sure that you want to carry on with this story?" And she looked at me really fiercely and said, "Absolutely, because I don't want anyone to be able to say that they didn't know." And I think, you know, that's very important, because if we stay silent, then things won't change. But I think, I mean, there are many, although there's lots of awful stories in the book, there's also, you know, some incredibly heroic people, male and female. I mean, Dr. McQuaggy, you know, but also among the people who I particularly will always remember are these 4 women in Rwanda who went and testified about what happened in Rwanda, where thousands of women, maybe 250,000 Tutsi women were raped by Hutus during the genocide in 1994. And again, at the end of that, everybody was focusing on the killing, and but then, and there started to be trials, and the first trial was of a mayor called John Paul Akayesu from a town called Taba, not far from the capital Kigali. And in the trial, one of the women was talking about what happened, and she said, "And then they raped me." And the prosecutor literally said, "Well, moving on, we're not interested in that." And fortunately, one of the 3 judges, and this is really important, was a female judge, a South African woman called Navi Pillay. And she said, "Hang on a minute, what do you mean they raped you?" And so the woman said, "Well, yeah, there was lots of rape. They were raping lots of women in the town hall." So then actually the trial ended up being stopped and the charges were changed to include sexual violence. And so it was the first time anywhere in the world that rape was prosecuted in an international court as a war crime. Not many people realize that that was as a result of these brave Rwandan women from a village living in huts with no electricity to this day, living in really terrible conditions, and yet they changed international legal history. But you know, when I was talking to them, and they said they were so happy when they got, because they risked their lives to testify, so happy when they heard that he had been convicted, and they danced when they heard the news. But they said to me, but we don't understand why it's still happening. We thought when we did that it would stop. And so they're really shocked to see the level that it is at today.
You know, one of the questions we have from Marna, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, is connected to that to some degree. What does justice look like for survivors of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence? And how important is reconciliation, especially if these women have to live side by side with the perpetrators, as for example in Rwanda?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think, you know, justice means different things to different people. Every woman I spoke to said they wanted justice. But it didn't necessarily mean, I think, to them that they wanted to see the person tried and convicted and put behind bars. In some cases, it meant they wanted their story heard and legitimized and recognized. And so I do think it is very important. And it seems to me more than a coincidence that there have been some successes in recent years, but there has always been a woman on the bench or a woman prosecutor. So that just shows, you know, how important it is to have women there in the room.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened in Bosnia, because I know those women really well, because I spent much time there, and they've done incredible work. And I think it's an example of what can happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Bosnia is really interesting. So to many of us, depending if you're my age, the first time we really became aware of this issue was Bosnia, because in the 1990s, you know, there was outrage internationally at the idea that there were rape camps in the center of Europe. And so, and people said never again. And there were international tribunals set up in The Hague. And personally, I imagined that, you know, that there had been a lot of trials and things that people had been convicted. So I was really shocked going back to Bosnia, talking to women, that actually very few people were convicted for the rape. And most of the women that I met told me that they still see their perpetrators in cafes or in the street, or maybe some of them are still working in the police force. Which is horrendous. I mean, imagine seeing that day after day. And so there's one particular woman who, you know, I'm sure Basira, who has incredibly feisty, brave woman who basically said, you know, I'm not accepting that, and set up this association of women. And not only did they come out and talk about what had happened, but they decided that they would do what the international courts and the police were not doing, and track down some of these men and try and bring them to justice. And she knew the number of every person working in the international court, and she would harangue them, and she'd find these men. And her organization have brought more than 100 men, found more than 100 war criminals and brought them to justice. It's quite astonishing what she's done. But I mean, at the other end too, you talked about the comfort women from Southeast Asia, and those women in Philippines, you know, they're in their late 80s. They were abducted when they hadn't even started their periods. They were like 13. And so they've been fighting for more than 75 years to try and get justice, and will probably die. There's not that many of them still surviving. Will probably die without getting justice. It's terribly sad. But, you know, what kind of precedent have we set up? Look, after the Second World War, when the first international tribunal was created in Nuremberg and also in Tokyo, not a single person was brought to justice for the sexual violence. And yet now we know it was actually massive. I'm not just talking about the hundreds of thousands of women captured by the Japanese army, but also the maybe as many as 2 million women in Germany and Central Europe who were raped by the Soviet forces, by the Red Army. But they also didn't speak out for a long time because it was considered shameful.
It's also true of women in the Holocaust, Jewish women who were taken by Nazis and raped, and they didn't speak out because of also the double stigma and humiliation. I think a question related to men just came in that's really interesting. And what beliefs about sex, sexuality, power, and intimacy must men and boys grow up having in order for rape to be used as a tool of war? And are there preventative interventions for boys and men that can curb the willingness to use sexual violence during war?
That's really interesting. I mean, obviously, writing a book like this and hearing all these stories, you start to wonder, you know, about men. And in fact, Anthony Beevor, who you mentioned, the military historian who wrote about Berlin and about the rape there, he said that it made him start to think, is there some kind of latent dark side in every man that would come out in this kind of situation? I mean, this cannot be about enjoyment, right? I mean, you're talking about people raping small children, raping women in their late 80s, raping, you know, where there's like 50 people raping the same woman in a rice paddy. This is not about that. It's not about sexual desire. It's about power. It's about humiliation. But also often in these cases, the fighters have been indoctrinated to think that the other side are inhuman, and like, you know, the way that Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches, and so they don't think that what they're doing is actually to a human being. And my fear is that, you know, the more this is allowed to happen, the more that it's going to just spread more and more. And I mean, I talked to some legal organizations in the Congo who have been fighting to try and bring justice, and they told me that even some of the judges that they're working with are sexually abusing girls because it's so widespread and accepted.
Well, look at the UN. Our peacekeepers are predators. They've been raping women in the countries they're meant to protect. I mean, there are rapists amongst all these forces, you know. I think this question is coming in various ways, but that there must be many children of rape in these conflicts. And we know, certainly at City of Joy, we are dealing with many women who have had children as a result of being raped, and really, really struggle to find a way to love their children, because when they look at them, they see the faces of their rapists. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what happens to these children in captivity and after, and how do women come to love their children? What happens in that dynamic?
It's really hard. I mean, as you say, for the women, seeing the children is a reminder of the worst day in their lives. And often it's not necessarily, it reminds them of the face of the rapist because they didn't even know who it was, because so many people raped them. So it's incredibly difficult. I mean, this is a big problem in Rwanda, and there's a lot of organizations, because you're talking, I mean, nobody knows how many, but at least 10,000 children born of rape. And I met some of the children and mothers, and I mean, some of the mothers frankly said that they wanted to kill their children, or they, you know, had just really couldn't accept them. But there are people working, organizations working with them, and, you know, making them realize that the children are innocent. They have nothing, they're not responsible for any of this. And so Rwanda has had some success in getting the children accepted. You have the same issue in Bosnia. Again, there are a lot of organizations working with the children and the mothers too. But you know, in some cases it works, and in some cases it doesn't. And the children also, you know, have the inherited trauma of what happened to their mothers, so they're often also very traumatized, and they don't understand, you know, often they don't realize they're being brought up in. I talked to one boy in Rwanda who was telling me about, you know, his mother was constantly rejecting him and he didn't understand why, and it wasn't until he was a teenager that he realized what, and people abused him in the village. And again, you know, he was a small child, he didn't know why this was happening, so it's incredibly cruel.
I also want to say that we have had at City of Joy where women go through a 6-month period of deep therapy and deep transformation and working on themselves. We have had success with women going through a process where they actually fall in love with their children and rebond with them. And I do think it's possible, but I do believe it's a long process. And we need money and we need resources and attention for this so that women can be supported in going through that process, because it's really treacherous. I think one of the other questions which is related to that is the challenges survivors face with getting sexual and reproductive health care and abortion services if they need them after being raped. And just talk a little bit about what you've seen in regard to that.
Yeah, I mean, just one remark on the last question too about the children of rape. I mean, it's important that religious leaders and community leaders talk about this and say that the children should be accepted, because you have the Yazidis, a terribly sad situation where their religious leader, Baba Sheikh, who actually sadly just passed away, but he had been persuaded to say to the community, look, these women didn't do anything wrong and they should be welcomed back, and indeed you should marry them because these women are heroic. And so that was a huge step, but he didn't say that the children should be allowed back, and there've been a lot of children born from their ISIS fighters, and so the poor Yazidi girls have been having to choose between whether to stay with their children or go back to their community. And so some have had to go abroad because that's the only way that they can keep their children and not face a lifetime of recriminations and rejection. So that's extremely difficult. But you just asked me about the
reproductive rights,
and the reproductive rights. Yeah, I mean, this is very important. And in many cases, we're talking about women in places where they don't have access to medical health and support. And so it's extremely important. And I'm sad to say that, I mean, some of the international UN resolutions have been watered down on this because of the Trump administration not wishing to support anything that to do with reproductive rights. So that's been a bit of a step backwards, I'm afraid.
I think one of the things I'd like to address, we have about 10 minutes left, and this question's been asked a few times, and it was actually one of my questions. I am with you in believing that because of the lack of, just because of impunity, because there has been very few cases brought to justice, because the world has never expressed the equivalent outrage and uproar to meet the intensity and the just the outrageousness of what's happening. I think we are seeing an escalation of sexual violence and across the planet. And I remember when I first went to Congo and saw what was happening there, after being in many places, I thought to myself, if this doesn't stop here, this will spread everywhere. And I was on the phone the other day with all of our coordinators from across Africa, and the phone call was organized to talk about land rights and the relationship to rape. and Nigeria was on the call, and Mali was on the call, and Ghana was on the call, and Congo was on the call. And what we're seeing across Africa is the situation where women are being forced off their land, and rape is used as a systematic tactic, whether the land is for extractive industries or the land is for farming. And I just want to ask you, Christina, after all you've been thinking, like, we know that the legal mechanisms are not working. They are not working. I'm just sorry. I call the UN the place of at this point. It is not. What can people do? What can be done? How do we really get change, make change?
Well, I mean, first of all, we don't set a great example in our own countries,
No, we
I
don't.
think.
But I'm talking about in our own countries as well. I'm not being specific.
Okay.
A tactic around the world.
But the fact is that, you know, it's extremely difficult to get people to really do anything about this unless you take away things that matter to them. And I think we do have a lot of influence here, because some of the countries where this is happening on a big scale, for example, South Sudan, are massively dependent on international aid. South Sudan has received $10 billion in US aid over the last 10 years, and it's one of the highest levels of rape in anywhere on earth. So, you know, why is the US government, when it's giving that aid, not stipulating that you must do something about this, and make this a key issue, and raise it at international forums, and not give aid to countries unless they do something? So we do have sway over the same with DRC and other countries.
Well, the problem, one of the big problems is if you have leaders of country, as in the case of the US, who are predators themselves and have had 25 women accusing them of rape, they often organize policies that actually move us backwards. And so we're looking at governmental structures that are run by patriarchs and predators. What can we do outside of that? Or besides getting rid of those leaders, obviously.
Yes, well, you have an election coming up.
Yes, we do.
No, I do think, you know, we can put pressure on our local representatives and on government to say, look, it's our taxpayers' money, shouldn't be going to countries that are doing these kind of things. I mean, my country, UK, actually had set up a department in its foreign ministry under a male foreign secretary called William Hague 6 years ago, to actually say this is a national security issue, and this is something really important to us. And he started raising at every single bilateral meeting he had with anybody around the world, he would raise this issue. And he said to me, many people would say to him, why are you raising this? It's a woman's issue. And he said, no, it's not a woman's issue. It's a national security issue, and it matters to all of us. And I mean, I don't want to be completely negative, because there have been some developments legally. And again, it's usually because of the great persistence and bravery of individuals rather than on an institutional level. But the other thing is that militaries are now taking this up much more and trying to change the culture, so it's no longer such a kind of laddish culture. And
where is that happening?
Well, in the UK, for example, but other countries too are starting to kind of bring this into the curriculum when they train their forces, and because there's no doubt that countries where this happens less seem to have more women in their military. So Israel, for example, there's very little sexual violence apparently, or certainly documented by their forces, and they have a much higher percentage of female fighters than most places. But you know, there's surprisingly little research done in this, why it happens in some places and not others. Another problem is, you know, many of the conflicts that are being fought now are not by states, they're, you know, ideological groups or religious groups or whatever, so you don't have the same ability to put pressure on them that you would if they were a state. But certainly there are cases where we do, as South Sudan is a perfect case. And you know what, it's ridiculous to be giving them so much money year after year when they're not doing anything about this issue.
And I also think it's looking at multinational corporations, because in conflict wars like the Congo and other places, you have to look at the companies that are actually extracting minerals from those countries, and they are responsible for those rapes, because those rapes are allowing them to take over those villages and take over those mines. I was just thinking what you were saying about women in armies and things, but we're also seeing, unfortunately, is women getting raped by soldiers in the US Army, for example. The rate of women being raped in the military is unbelievably high. And I would bet that's true in Israel as well. There is no reason why that wouldn't be true. I'm sure it's just not getting reported. But I think,
I wasn't talking about within their army. I was talking
no,
about.
I know. I was just,
yeah.
But I feel like we have 3 minutes left, and I just want you to say I first want to thank you for all of us, and thank all the people who have been asking such fantastic questions here. I'm sorry we haven't gotten to all of them, but we have gotten to a lot of them. And please buy her book. I'm going to hold it up. It's an amazing book. It's an important book. The more you know, the more outraged you will be. And I feel like Christina has done the impossible. She's put so many countries together and so many stories together. And you can't read this book and not feel compelled to act. So you have 3 minutes left. And I just want you to say whatever you want to say, closing this, like what you want people to know as we stop.
Yeah, I just want people to, you know, think about these women in all these places. You know, we had the Me Too movement 3 years ago, and you know, that was amazing to see what it has achieved. But you know, you remember the tremendous difficulty even for women in our societies to come forward and speak out about what was happening to them. So imagine in countries and places where the perpetrators are people that you actually live with, who are running your area, who have all the weapons, who run the government, and you don't have access to media or lawyers or finance to do anything, and how incredibly difficult it is. So I think that it's really time that we end the silence on this issue. I know that these are really difficult stories. It's weird to write a book that's kind of quite hard to read, but there are lots of heroes in the book, including some really amazing male heroes like Dennis Mukwege. And it's just very important that we start to say that this isn't acceptable anymore, and otherwise it's just going to keep spreading more and more.
And if I can just make one little plug for 1 Billion Rising, which is a worldwide international movement to end violence against women across the world. You can get involved, go to 1billionrising.org. You can create risings against these war crimes in various countries, and you can join with other women around the world who work on a grassroots basis every day to stop these crimes. Thank you so much, Christina. You're amazing. Your reporting is amazing. Your bravery, your willingness to keep going back into the pain, to dig out the truth for us. I'm so grateful, and I know we are all so grateful to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Let me thank everyone who's attended this event. And of course, many thanks to V and Christina for a very important, sometimes difficult, but a very important conversation that we have had. Before we do leave, there is something that we ask of all our authors, and this will be for both V and Christina. We ask, is there anything you're currently reading? And if so, could you please share that with us today?
Go ahead, Christina.
Okay. Well, I'm always reading. I find it difficult to answer because I always have lots of books at once. But, I'm just reading two things particularly at the moment. One is a very small book, which is by a Rwandan author, and I'm probably going to get her name wrong, called Scholastic Mukasonga. And it's a little book called The Barefoot Woman. And it's just an absolutely beautiful book about motherhood and what happened in Rwanda. It's very small. And I'm also rereading Vasily Grossman's book of Life and Fate, which I think is a book that you can keep dipping into and getting different things. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to look for both those books. I just finished a gorgeous book by Eddie Glad called Begin Again, which is, James Walden is one of my favorite writers on the planet. And Eddie has done this reframing, this relooking, this reinvestigation of Baldwin that brings it so close to where we are right now. And living in a country where we have a predator in chief who refused to stand up and discount and disacknowledge and speak out against white supremacy. It's a very critical book to be reading right now in yeah, there you go. In really becoming the most powerful anti-racist you can become.
Yeah, it's a pretty good book. Once again, thank you both for this discussion. This was very, very important and very informative. And thank you all for joining us. I want to wish everyone a good evening and hope to see you again in the near future.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.